Welcome back to Keep Making. I'm Matt, and today I'm going to show you how I made this fantasy city village thing. Let's get to it.
Shall we begin?
So let's start off with what I was trying to do. I wanted to make a generic enough village or city type setting that was modular, meaning we could play inside and outside of the buildings, or that they can be put in any sort of circumstance. So whether this is a new city, an older rundown city, a city in the winter, or a city in any other season, I wanted this to fit wherever so I don't have to make multiples of these. So that was the plan.
So I bet the first thing you're wondering is, how did this take a year? Like the thumbnail says, and promise I will get to that, but let's start off with the process. So first I took all these 3D prints. These are all free files, Ulvheim files or other free files I found on Thingiverse. The links will be in the description below. Laid them all out and I got to priming. This is just a rattle can primer, Rust-Oleum I believe, just a basic gray primer, and I'm hitting every single piece with this. I moved on to a zenithal highlight with a white spray can to hit all the roofs in the outside areas.
Yeah, good job. Yeah, good job. Oh, way too much. Looks like a little ladybug.
Then I'm moving on to the colors. The walls are all getting this darker gray, and then the roofs are getting color, and then the mortar sort of walls are getting a sand sort of beigey color. And before some of you may comment, just to let you know, my nephew and I are both wearing respirators, and the garage door is a little bit open as well as the back door. You can see I look a little bit different in this footage. That's because this was filmed a year and a half ago. This is the point in the build where I was, marking my next steps, which would be to paint the wooden elements. But I go over sort of what went wrong with the steps I had already done. This early in the process, there were already mistakes that I was going to have to account for as we progressed on. That's not the exact reason why I chose to put this project down for a year. The real reason is, like everyone else living through this pandemic, motivation is tough at times. My original reason for doing this is because I had just got a 3D printer, and this is the first time that I was going to be able to print terrain and these things that I wasn't able to make before, like buildings and houses, to the detail that I would want them on my table. I was now able to print and paint, and that was super exciting, but the inability to play a D&D game during this time was super frustrating, and it made doing projects like these super unrewarding. Even though, as it stands right now, I haven't used these in a game, at this point in time, about a year and a half ago, the idea of going through with this whole project, while I had other things I could be making money off of, or things that were, more appealing in the moment, I guess, rewarding right away, this project was just not one of those. It made me sad to know I couldn't see my friends at the D&D table, and that these pieces, as hard as I would work on them, would end up just being, collecting dust on the shelf. So I was super unmotivated, and I ended up having to put this down. So like I stated earlier, there was things that I needed to go over. One of those things here is that because there was stone parts on the top and bottom of these print sections, I'd need to match the color of the bottom. So What I did to do that is I just mixed some gray with some black to try to get that same darker stone color I spray painted on the bottom halves like you see here. Then I moved on to the stonework as a whole. To bring some detail in, I used that same gray color, not mixed with black, and I'm doing not quite a dry brush. In the dry brush, we take most of the paint off of the brush. Here, I'm just taking some of the paint off the brush. It's called an overbrush, and that's going to bring out that stone color a little bit more. Once I've overbrushed all the stone, here's how we're looking. Now moving on to the mortar element. So we're using this corn silk from Craft Smart Paint, and I'm just going to go into all the areas that had that initial spray paint color, and we're just adding some layers. The reason I have to do this is because I was very half-assed with my approach to the spray painting, and I want all of these pieces to be consistent. So I'm just applying a layer or two of this to every piece, and then we'll move on from there. Because I didn't have a stable way to paint these, there's some smudging going on, so I just use a wet Q-tip to clean those up. And now for the most tedious part of this build. I'm going over all the wooden elements with this coffee brown from Folk Art Craft Paint, and I have to do that 4 or 5 times. This paint does not like to adhere to the spray paint, whether it's primer or these layers of color I put on afterwards. Maybe I could have varnished it. Maybe I could have not cheaped out and gone for a hobby or model paint and got better coverage that way. But honestly, even one pass of this sucked. The fact that I had to do 3 or 4 of them really sucked. And I do not want to ever have to do this again. I know that I will, because I have other builds coming down the pike that I'm excited for you guys to see. And so for those ones, I am going to try using model paint or varnish to speed up this process, because going over all these wooden elements multiple times was terrible. I also used the same coffee brown for all the floorboards and wood paneling and planking inside. "19 years later, when all the wood elements have been painted, here's how we're looking. Now I'm going in with some Vallejo bronze. This is to do all of the fireplace elements that are inside these Ulvheim pieces. I just wanted to break up some of the monotonous gray on the inside of these pieces and give it a little bit more detail. Obviously, if we're moving to play D&D with these, I'm going to put some household objects and stuff like that if we're using the interiors. But then we're moving on to the windows, which I just used this steel again from Vallejo. I think this is an airbrush color, but it's super thin and nice to work with, so I like using it for applications like these in these tough to reach areas. After the windows are finished, I'm doing all the outside spiky bit things, and then all of the nails in the wood planking. Yep, all of them. And now we're moving on to a dry brush. This is Cashmere Tan. This is one of my favorite colors to dry brush with by a brand called Acrylique. I think it's French, I don't know. But this is what I use to dry brush any sort of wood element. I think it brings out a really nice worn sort of wood color. So I go over, again, all the wood elements, get this dry brush. Just one coat though. Dry brushing, for anyone who doesn't know, is when you put paint on your brush, a flat brush usually, wipe most of it off, and then hit the edges of your piece with that same brush. And as you can see here, it just brings out the highest details of your piece. what it can also do is bring out some weathering. So you'll see me here use it a little bit in the corners or on the walls where the layer lines of the print are pretty good. That way I can bring out some wear and tear. Look, dirt is accumulating here, but then on the wood elements, it looks like it's been pulled back. I love using this color on painted elements because it looks like the paint is chipping off. As you can see here on the roof, it just looks like that paint is fading, weathering away with time, and I love that. Yeah. And before we do a wash, some final detailing, going in with that brown again to do the fireplaces, and then using some red leather on the rope elements that are on some of the tops of these buildings. So now moving on to the wash, I mixed some black and some brown, and I'm applying this all over the piece. Now never mind these details you see, that yellow and sort of orangish color, just forget about it. Experiment gone wrong. Adding the wash, because not only will it give us some dimensionality by pulling in the recesses, it gives us some weathering by applying that sort of blackish brownish tone to make these buildings dirtier, and it tones and filters the whole piece, so it's all getting the same sort of application. It's bringing all of these colors in and adding some variance, as well as a sort of combining filter. Areas where it's not running quick enough, I just spray some water to get it going, and after this we can get to the final reveal.
So right before we get into the final reveal here, let's talk about things that went wrong throughout. So first and foremost, I want to address the zenithal highlight. I lost a lot of it by overspraying with the colored sprays, so that made that step pretty useless. In the future, I think I got to tone back some of the coats of the spray paint just so that we're keeping that zenithal intact, giving a little bit of shade and realism. The next thing was blocking out the colors. So when I'm determining which elements need to be painted by hand, that should take the consideration when we talk about which areas need paint. So maybe on those tan areas, if painting those isn't hard, maybe I spray paint everything with like the chocolate brown so that I don't have to paint all the beams by hand. Or maybe I spray paint everything tan still, including the roofs, which I can then add color to later on. Just things like that. I think I didn't do the best job of that here, and then that makes color matching later on. So that means I actually end up having to paint all the tan areas because I didn't pay close enough attention to that. So I think that's an area that this could have improved, the zenithal highlight as well, and just not leaving this project sitting around for a year. It's tough over the last couple of years to find the motivation to want to do D&D specific projects because it's not like I can have people over to play right now. So, I printed these pieces because I was super excited to get the printer and start printing terrain. And then, when these sort of deadlines and restrictions and lockdowns sort of get extended, the idea of playing D&D just became less realistic. So that I didn't really have a use for this project, but now it got to the point where this is just taking up too much space and I have other projects I need to get to, so this needs to get out of the way. So all in all, I think we accomplished that at least.
And without any further ado, here is the final reveal.
Well, that'll do it for this episode of Keep Making. Thank you so much for checking it out. Make sure you're hitting the like button and the subscribe button so you're seeing when my new videos come out, and hit that bell if you want to be notified when they do. I want to thank you guys for watching, and just want to say, whether you know you're locked down because of COVID restrictions, or that's not a thing where you're at right now, by the time you're seeing this video, or where you live, make sure you keep making.